So with that, let's go. I'm going to talk about the good, the bad, and the unfinished business, the stuff that's still in the pipeline. And let me immediately say there, in advance, for I know there are people here from various government agencies dealing with socio-economic impact assessments, that will not be critical. On the contrary, our own policy in South Africa says that it's ongoing business, not only that the assessments continue after the initial one and the measures are improved, but that the process of honing how we do assessments and what we do is itself an ongoing issue. And so we can all contribute to how to sharpen the process. The concept, firstly, is that the idea is to ensure that benefits exceed costs. Now, this is an economics term, and many non-economists think the word costs means a monetary thing. This is not what is intended or meant in economics at all. A better word would have been things like disadvantages or negatives or whatever. So the economics terminology benefits, good things, positives, as a result of a particular measure should exceed bad things, negatives, unintended consequences, secondary effects, market distortions, impacts on vulnerable groups, for example, the poor or women or children or whatever it might be, disabled people. So the idea is that every measure should be carefully considered from the point of view of what will the negatives be. And the important part of it is that it is always assumed there will be negatives. You see, typically what you get in policy formation anywhere in the world, and we're all guilty of it around the dinner party or over coffee or a drink, is we all say, we all have a notion of free lunches. We all think there can be benefits that are at no cost. So we will say, why don't they pay teachers more, you know? And one of the things that you should always then do, if you understand the idea of costs and benefits, is you would say, where will that money come from? And you might say, for example, well, let's have more children dying in pediatric units. Well, that is what you're saying. If you say, let's pay teachers more, you're saying, let's take money away from something else. Well, what is the something else that you're taking money away from? So I always encourage people to maybe just once in their life, when they make a proposal, start with saying what the cost is. Start by saying, I want improved infrastructure. Instead of saying that, you say, what I want is more rape, because what you're saying is take money away from policing and spend it on infrastructure. And so this is the important part of the notion. The idea is always say at what cost. What is the negative to the positive you want to achieve? And unfortunately, pretty much every policy ever introduced prior to socio-economic impact assessment in any country of the world gets introduced as if there are free lunches, as if you can have benefits with no cost. You can't. And so the first thing that is involved is to be clear about the fact that there are costs, to be honest about them, to try and identify them, and to satisfy yourself as a policymaker that the benefits will exceed those costs. And the costs, sadly, let me say well in advance, almost always fall disproportionately on people less able to afford them. Those are people who don't, for example, lobby because they're disorganized, maybe consumers, for example. So let's take a simple thing like what Donald Trump is obsessed with, which is protectionism. Bring jobs back to America, you know, manufacture in America, make things in America, stop importing things from China and India. Well, the benefit is that you protect a few American companies, but never is it stated that you do so by raising the prices of things that are imported at lower cost to the poor. The poor are the ones who pay for those benefits. So this is a direct transfer of wealth, what Donald Trump would be proposing, from the poor, those are the people who would be getting cheaper Chinese products, for example, to the rich, those are the people who would be producing them uncompetitively and therefore needing protection. We have that in South Africa. We have this cliche, this meme, We must beneficiate. This is like a for everybody. Let's beneficiate, you see. Now, I often wonder if people who say that, have they spent as little as 1 second thinking about what they're saying? They're saying that for some obscure reason, something that happens to be in the ground here is something we can process efficiently. There's no reason whatever why that should be the case. All raw materials have the same price everywhere in the world. They're uniformly priced. We have nothing to do with the prices. We have the same access to every mineral and resource in the world, regardless of where it comes from, that everyone else does. So there's no logic, there's no sort of economic sense. But if you want to so-called beneficiate, which really is another way of saying process a mineral we happen to produce by sheer geological coincidence, uncompetitively and inefficiently. So we never say, but the cost of that is we have less people doing things that you can export. We have less foreign exchange that we will earn. We have higher price of things to the poor. We have shorter lists of options available, and so on. So I've spent some time on that because it's very, very important to understand that an honest and genuine purpose of socio-economic impact assessment is to stop this business of presuming that there's a free lunch, is to always say, hold on a sec, if you do X, what do you not do? And is that what we do not do because we do X? A, B, C, D, E, F, G is what we do not do. We don't know. It's the unseen. It's the invisible. We don't have a factory. We don't know which factory. Would it have been a shoe factory, a bicycle factory? We don't have jobs. Would they have been labor intensive, technology intensive? We don't know whether what we would otherwise have done would have been internationally competitive or not, whatever. So the trouble is when you direct resources towards, for example, infrastructure, you never know from where you took them. You don't know what you sacrificed. You have better infrastructure. Does that mean you have higher rape rates? Does it mean you have higher infant mortality? Does it mean you have higher literacy? Does it mean you have less policing? Does it mean you have worse health care? You know, and so on. So the point is something else you've got less of. And that's one of the things you try to identify. So how do you do this? Well, that's interesting. Oh, it wasn't clever. The mouse has stopped working. Let's see what we can do here. Okay, how do you do this assessment? Well, firstly, the concept. I'm going to discuss the concept at some greater length. You've got the broad purpose. The concept is, there's more to it, by the way, seeing that it complies with the Constitution and that it complies with principles of good law, that the law is accessible, that it's objective, and we'll get to some of that later. That's what's actually lacking in our process in South Africa at the moment, what would be called quality of law aspects. So what you want to do firstly is you want to define and quantify a problem. In other words, you want to say, why do you want to measure at all? Now let me give you a good example in South Africa where there apparently is a socio-economic impact assessment. It is not available to the public. It has not been published. Nobody has any idea why it's there. But this very much vaunted, and there are probably in this room people who think it's a good idea, this Twin Peaks legislation for financial services, giving the Financial Services Board market conduct regulation and giving the Reserve Bank prudential or solvency regulation of insurers and banks. And nobody has said, well, at what cost? What will we sacrifice in order to have Twin Peaks? And what will the benefit of Twin Peaks be? What will be better afterwards than it was before? But more seriously, nobody has said what the problem is. There just are sort of amorphous problems that need to be solved. Nobody said we have this many dodgy deals. We have, these are how many Ponzi schemes we're going to prevent. We've had insurers going insolvent, 5 of them, and we therefore need to stop that happening in future and so on. So no, there's nothing like that at all. On the contrary, it seems as if our financial services are about as robust and healthy as they could be. We haven't had a single person losing any money from an insurer that's gone under. We have had some Ponzi schemes from which people have lost money despite the fact that the Financial Services Board had all the powers it wanted and said it would prevent it happening. It didn't, so it failed. So giving it more power will not enable it to do anything better. And so we have no idea, no South Africans, no one in this room, if you're from the Department of Finance, from the Treasury, I believe some people are, then I challenge you to show me where was the problem statement, what lawyers call the mischief principle. What is it precisely that you wanted to fix? And in what way will this particular change in the architecture of how you regulate financial services fix it? To what extent will it be fixed? How many, you've got to quantify everything. And incidentally, in our guidelines, it says you can't quantify everything. It says almost everything should be, but there are sometimes things you can't. For example, social benefits, you know, children being better nourished or whatever. No, the experience elsewhere in the world is they have concluded that you actually can and must quantify absolutely everything. And the seminal example in the United Kingdom, which by the way has led the pack, it has been the leader of the whole notion in the world, it's spent more time on it. America started it earlier, but the UK became the recognized expert in the field, and it had some bad experiences. One of them was they didn't try to quantify everything. And then eventually Tony Blair, to his credit, said, no, this is actually not right. There is nothing that can't be quantified. So, for example, they had the dangerous dog legislation, was the seminal example. What happened is some pit bull terriers attacked and killed some children, very gruesome, horrible stuff. There was public outcry. There was the usual knee-jerk reaction of legislators and policymakers to do something. So what do? They make a law saying everyone has to register dangerous dogs and has to go to dog training sessions, and they will be monitored, and if they do something wrong they'll be put in pounds and so on and so forth. The regulatory impact assessment studied how many dog attacks were there. How many fewer dog attacks will there be if you implement this measure? What will the cost of policing it and administering it be? What will the cost of compliance be? Now, the cost isn't just money. The cost is time. The cost is inconvenience. The cost is effort. What will the ability to actually enforce the law be? And by the time they did the regulatory impact assessment on the very popular idea of a dangerous dog law, it was quite clear that the costs, the disadvantages would exceed the benefits would be negligible. The cost per, if any at all, dog attack avoided would be millions of pounds, and therefore just not worth it. You could save many, many more lives and achieve a great deal more benefit by spending that money, for example, on healthcare or literacy or better roads, you know, better intersections where you know in advance how many fatal accidents there will be at a given intersection. Engineers can make a prediction for that, and they can say, if we spend another 20 million rand on this intersection, we can predict one less fatal accident at that intersection per year. So everything can be quantified in numbers. How much will things change? And so that is one of the things you need to try to do, and in South Africa, I hope we will. I hope the little escape clauses saying sometimes you can't won't be abused here as it has been elsewhere in the world, where that was just used as an excuse then to actually not quantify anything and just be nebulous. So the benefits will be, you know, better environment, more happiness for children at school, whatever it might be. So you get behind these amorphous claims of benefits. No, that's not good enough. You've got to actually say, how many people will benefit? In what way will they benefit? What will the benefit be? How will it be different from what went before, and so on? So then you have to predict and quantify the benefits, the positives. Now that's quite important. You have to make an actual prediction. You have to say, if you introduce this measure, for example, mine mineral right nationalization, say there was a Socio Economic Impact Assessment done at the time, which there wasn't, but let's say there was. It would have had to say, would there be more mines or less mines? Would there be more mine jobs or less mine jobs? Would we produce more minerals or less minerals? How many more would we export? Would we earn less foreign exchange or more? And if it's less, it'll be so much less, and so on and so forth. Nothing like that was done. So mineral rights were nationalized as some kind of amorphous thing. Well, they belong to the nation and therefore they should belong to the government. But nobody actually ever spent any time or effort at all trying to work out what the consequences would be for jobs, for the environment, for exports, for foreign exchange earnings, for investment in South Africa. Was just never done. And so that is the sort of thing that you get, rightly or wrongly, we don't know, we have no idea, but what they would have done is made concrete predictions. We now have X number of mines. If we do this, we will have Y number of mines. We now employ so many people in the mines. If we do this, we will employ that many people in the mines over that period. So you make concrete forecasts, and then what you do is you monitor those forecasts and see whether they materialize. If you take, for example, the first cost-benefit analysis done in South Africa, which was done for the Financial Advisory and Intermediary Services Act, that, as far as I know, is the first formal attempt, proper attempt at doing one. And it did exactly that. It made actual predictions. This is how many less policies would be surrendered, and this is how much better the rates of return will be for people in financial markets, and it made these predictions. The interesting thing is nobody's bothered to go back and see, did those predictions materialize? For example, it had predictions about the cost to government and about the compliance cost. And the truth is, well, somebody has, but not in government, not in the Treasury, and there are people here from the Treasury, and I want to encourage you to go away, dig out the cost-benefit analysis, compare it to what has in fact happened, and you will be shocked to find that absolutely nothing that was predicted has materialized. In fact, quite the opposite has happened. It has had, if it has had any effect at all, it has made the things it said would be better, in fact, are much worse. And the costs have been exceeded by many-fold, not even just 50 or 100%, but hundreds of percent. And the things that were meant to improve actually deteriorated, like premature surrenders of policies, and the number of people serving consumers. Access, again, the victims always are the lower income group. Access to the poor, for the poor, to financial services was improving very rapidly. There was a Black Brokers Association formed. It was a big area of transformation in South Africa. Thousands of black brokers and agents serving people who'd never been served before in the so-called townships, middle and lower income areas. They have essentially vanished. And in fact, the Financial Services Board, so far from improving access to financial services, far from improving opportunities in financial services, quite the opposite has happened. I've been asking people in insurance if they know any brokers in South Africa, independent brokers, in particular black brokers, and nobody can tell me of any at all. There does seem to be a sort of little association, not the original, of a few around, but the Financial Services Board boasted to Parliament last year that it had delisted something like 15,000 independent brokers and agents, or financial services provided, and it was proud of that fact. And that's about the only thing they say they've achieved. The only thing they've done is to drive thousands of people out of business and, of course, millions of consumers from having the services they would have offered. And it's proud about that fact, and I want you to make your own guess about what the color and the socio-economic group might have been of the people they drove out of business. The Black Brokers Association did give evidence at the time the bill was before Parliament in 2001, and its words were that if this bill is passed, there will be carnage in the black brokers industry, and they were absolutely right. The carnage was pretty much 100%, just wiped out completely. And so this is the sort of thing, you have a quantified prediction that you can go back to and look at and say, the opposite in fact happened. Now, what you should therefore do is you should say, well, in that case, repeal the measure or revisit the measure or reform or change the measure. But this is what the strength of such a thing should be. What was used, it was used purely as an excuse to get the bill through Parliament. No one had any intention whatever of ever going back and looking at this thing again. So it was a complete waste of money. It turned out to be just a propaganda exercise, not an exercise in serious attempt at socio-economic impact assessment. So you want to quantify the benefits and predict the outcomes that you can see later on. Did they materialize? And you want to predict and quantify the negatives. You can go later on and see, did it cost as much as we said it would, or did it cost more, or did we save? You know, did it create more or less jobs, and that sort of thing. Then you want to monitor and measure actual outcomes. Now this is quite important. Our guidelines say this will happen, and I would love to know from members of our steering committee, who I believe some are in the audience, if there is a proper monitoring mechanism. Now this should be obligatory. So every new measure at every level of government, including non-cabinet measures, quite important. So some rule or guideline or law is passed by a minister under some regulatory authority, and it's unclear as to whether this or how this applies to second and third tier government, municipalities and so on. But it should apply to everybody, absolutely every measure, policy measure, legal measure, regulatory measure should be subjected to a socio-economic impact assessment. And as our guidelines say, there must be balance. In other words, if it's really a technical or trivial thing being introduced, you don't need to spend a huge amount of money doing it. But if it's some big change that you're making, then you need to invest a lot of time and effort. And you have to make sure that there is a monitoring mechanism in place. So if we go back to the Financial Advisory and Intermediary Services Act, what they should have done at the time, the Treasury, is they should have created a time, you know, after a year, 2 years, whatever, the outcomes will be quantified and they will be fed into a system, and they will see whether their targets were met, and if they weren't, they will go back to the drawing boards and say what went wrong, and if they can't work out what went wrong, you actually repeal the measure. And Australia, for example, is because of this frustration of not going back and not actually seeing what happened, introduced a 10-year sunset clause. They say every new measure will lapse after 10 years unless it is motivated from scratch that it should be extended. In other words, there is no assumption that the fact that it was decided as desirable 10 years ago means it's desirable 10 years later. You have to go back 10 years later and say, this is what we said we would achieve, this is what has in fact happened, and therefore the measure should be extended. Unless you can show that it has achieved its objectives or something like them, then the measure lapses. It literally disappears. Then you have to take corrective action. What do you do if you're not achieving objectives? Costs exceed benefits. An obvious example in South Africa would be South African Airways. Say, for example, there were a socio-economic impact assessment on South African Airways. Year after year after year after year, it's predicted that there will be no more subsidies. South African Airways will be profitable, will be viable. It goes on for literally not even years, but decade after decade after decade, right back into the dark days of apartheid. And what happens year after year after year? The promises do not materialize, costs exceed benefits, huge subsidies have to be paid, and this cliche that they're paid by the taxpayer always fascinates me. They're not at all. You in this room are taxpayers. Nobody ever came to you and said, look, we have to bail out SA Airways, we need a few more rands tax from you, please. No, what they do is they take the money from something else. You see, this is important to understand. When you give 3 billion rand to SA Airways, you give 3 billion rand less to protecting women and children. You'd have 3 billion rand less for pediatric care in hospitals, and you have dead children. I mean, this is what you've got to understand. You've got to understand you actually kill children when you transfer money from one expenditure to another, or what you do is you cause illiteracy, or you have more road deaths, or you have more crime, or whatever it is, less jobs and so on. So less housing, more shack dwellers. This is the price you pay. So that it's a transfer of wealth directly from the poor to the rich who fly. Poor people do not fly. Rich people do. People like you in this room fly. All of you fly. And you are the ones who are being subsidized by someone living in a shack or some child that is now dying of lack of pediatric care and will be dead by the time this talk is finished. That is the price you pay. And that is what socio-economic impact assessment tries to avoid. So you take corrective action, you fix it if it doesn't work. And obviously no attempt has been made to fix South African Airways. On the contrary, all that has been done is the failure has just been perpetuated endlessly. This is a weird sort of apartheid dinosaur that lives on. The ghost of Verwoerd sits, I don't know if you've noticed him, there's always a seat reserved on every SA Airways flight for him. He sits there with a big smile on his face saying, if I knew the ANC would implement my policies and perpetuate my dinosaurs, I would have handed over power long ago. And he enjoys every flight. What is the history? Let's run quickly through what has happened in the world. Firstly, there are lots of policy processes and publications on the subject, and it's become a very, very rich and complex literature, and controversial literature in some cases, because in some cases there's more of an emphasis on economics, and others it's more social, and others it's more cultural, and so on and so forth. So quite what it should be doing, and the answer is it should be doing everything. It should be looking at the benefits and disadvantages, however defined. Management and budgetary statements have been common and have been around for a very long time. In fact, our custom in South Africa, going back to, I don't know, days of early union, I suppose, was to have an explanatory memorandum with each bill, at least, that gets tabled in Parliament or bylaw in the City Council or whatever. And that is a kind of crude, ill-defined socio-economic or regulatory impact assessment. That's what it's really meant to be, but it actually never is. Give you a simple example. My favorite pet hate, the Financial Advisory and Intermediary Services Act, which is really, in my view, one of the most extraordinary aberrations that's ever hit this country, and I seem to be the only person who's noticed that fact. What's interesting about it is that there is no attempt at working out what it costs. They literally go to Parliament, the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee, and say with a straight face, we are going to introduce Twin Peaks, for example. It's happening now as we speak. And there will be no budgetary implication. There's no cost at all, zero. So this is a hell of a fantastic thing. I mean, there is, after all, therefore, a free lunch. You can get these amazing benefits, which are unquantified and unarticulated, at no cost. Well, why will there be no cost? Well, the answer is they're just going to impose a levy on everybody who operates, which ultimately, of course, means consumers. So consumers will just pay more. So something like an extra 4 billion rand, which is probably what it's going to cost, will simply be taken from consumers. Now, again, rich consumers probably won't even notice the difference. But what this means is that poor consumers, it's a regressive tax. In other words, the cost to poor people is higher than the cost to rich people, proportionately and in absolute terms. And because, let me give a simple example, each small transaction carries the same cost as a big transaction. So poor people have lots of little transactions, rich people have maybe a few big transactions, but the administrative cost is the same. So poor people end up paying more. And so there will be billions of rands fleeced off the poor in what is not being called a tax. It should actually, under our constitution, be a fiscal measure that has to go through Parliament, but they literally go in with a straight face, lie. It is a lie, and I don't apologize in the face of the press for putting it that bluntly, to go and tell Parliament there will be no cost. That is what they have said. And they know it's a lie. Of course they know it's a lie. Of course they've had to work out budgets for renting new offices and buying new computers, imposing new forms and so on. That's what, as I said, explanatory memorandum are meant to have done. It really started in the 1970s in the USA with management and budget assessments, and in the UK with regulatory impact assessments in a very crude form. They had a lot to learn. They got it all wrong, essentially. They cut their teeth and they worked through the process, improving, and that is what we have to do. In 1978, the first real regulatory impact assessment was believed to have done under Jimmy Carter, called the Inflation Impact Assessment of monetary policy and price controls. It was the first, let's say, semi-sophisticated attempt at one. In 1980, the idea spread to Europe and the OECD. The OECD is a collection of, for those who don't know, something like, 27, 28 countries, mainly developed countries, that are in this organization of economic development. So all OECD countries agreed in 1995. Every single one is meant to have socio-economic impact assessment. In fact, some have to this day not yet implemented it, but they are all contractually committed and bound to it from 1995. So we're talking about 11 years later, 20 years later, they still haven't done it. Then in 1998, Britain really took it to the, let's call it stage 2, or the more advanced level of something really quite sophisticated, with guidelines something like what we have in South Africa. That's when it really took on a more advanced form, and it spread then to developed economies all over the world, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, European Union and others, and then after 2000 it started spreading into less developed countries, countries like India, where I in fact visited their people responsible for it there, and in other countries in the developing world, Nigeria, Brazil, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on. So the international approaches are that the different countries do things differently, and then we'll get on to what we do and maybe what the strengths and weaknesses are of what we do. The UK has a powerful regulatory impact assessment unit in the Cabinet Office. Now this is really quite important. What happened in the UK is what they did here. They started like we do, where every department and agency that wants to do something, has a policy or legislative proposal, does its own impact assessment. It soon became obvious that that's an entirely pointless exercise. It's a complete waste of time. Obviously, anyone who does their own, who self-assesses, will simply produce something that justifies what they want to do. It'll just be a sham. And that became very clear. So they thought, what do? They had really one of two very basic options. Either you have them done by an autonomous agency, something quite separate, almost like a Chapter 9 institution, like the Auditor General or the State Law Advisor or somebody like that. You set up an office that does the actual assessment. So what happened, that was one option. They didn't go that way in Britain. They did, for example, in Australia and some other countries. So, or in the Netherlands. So what happened is they then said, no, what we'll do is we'll set up an autonomous unit within the Cabinet Office. And this is the one I studied most closely and visited and spent most time with, so I could speak with most authority on and have written about. But long story cut short is it really works like this. What happens is a department, say the Department of Trade and Industry, wants a new labeling law for consumer products. It wants sugar to carry a health warning or whatever it might be. They then have to explain to the Cabinet unit why they think this is a good idea in a provisional assessment. And if the Cabinet unit thinks they've got a defensible case, then they go on and they produce a final assessment, and it goes to the Cabinet Office, and the Cabinet Office assesses this. And if they disagree, they literally go to the Cabinet and they say, we don't like that department's assessment. We think they're wrong for the following reasons, because of course the department just whitewashes whatever it wants to do. And we in South Africa are unfortunately going to have to learn a bitter lesson. I don't think that is clear yet. We will soon realize that it is entirely pointless to simply say to the department, you produce an impact assessment to these guidelines. They will produce something that is a sham, that will just simply make it look as if what they want to do is a good idea. It'll change nothing. It'll have no effect whatsoever on new policies and laws, until you have something like the assessment unit, or in our case the steering committee, which would have to be given the same level of power, an absolute veto right, and a requirement to say, no, you may not proceed. In fact, in Britain, you may not even table the measure before a minister until the Cabinet Office has signed it off as being properly and authentically and independently justified. And if they disagree with each other, then they go and fight it out before the cabinet. So you sometimes get opposing submissions where the cabinet office unit says, we're sorry, we think this has not been properly done. And the department is just trying to justify its own empire building. Our guidelines talk a lot about the danger of vested interests, meaning labor and business and NGOs and so on, so activists and what have you. But they don't talk about, this is sorely lacking in our guidelines, is the biggest and worst vested interest of all is empire building, is the people who propose the measure. They want more power, they want more status, they want a bigger budget, they want a bigger office. Of course, they are self-serving like anyone else. So in Britain, the cabinet unit polices that. In the USA, they have an independent Office of Management and Budget. It undertakes the study itself. It says what it thinks, the implications of what some other department, Home Affairs, Hillary Clinton's emails, what are the implications of those? They will decide. And the Department of Home Affairs can, or whatever that is, Foreign Affairs or Affairs of State, or I don't know how many affairs Hillary has or where she has them, but anyway. So they would do that way there. They would do this different thing. And then Australia and New Zealand have a centralized regulatory impact statement. They call them RIS, RIS, Regulatory Impact Statement Authority, and they get submissions from the departments on what they want to do, and then they do the assessment and send it back, and the department can come and lobby and argue with them and so on. So there's a very clear mindset over there, just bear this in mind, that you can't trust the people who propose a measure to do it properly. Now, we in South Africa are a little bit naive if we think that's going to happen. Very naive, actually. We haven't realized what the rest of the world had to go through. You have to actually realize that you have to take them firmly and say, no, this is not just another way of whitewashing, justifying, propagandizing what you want to do in your own bureaucratic interests, build a bigger empire, etc., etc. Japan has an interesting approach. It has assessments done by every other department. So every measure by every department has to be sent to every other department, and every other department gets asked, what do you think the implications of this are for you? So I'll give you a simple example. If you criminalize smoking within 10 meters of an entrance or somewhere, then the police will come back and say, well, we will have to have so many more police, and the courts will have to say, we will have to have so many more magistrates, and I don't know, the roads department will have to say how it's going to deal with stompies, or I don't know what. But every other department has to come and say, the implications of your measure for me are the following. And a classic example would be in the old days building Sun City in BOP. There was no impact assessment, for example, for the roads department. The roads department has to suddenly go and spend hundreds of millions making good roads to this place in the middle of nowhere in an extinct volcano. So nobody counted that in. So Sol Kerzner basically got other departments of the government to subsidize the building of Sun City by many millions, but it was more than that. Education department had to go and build schools there. The police had to go and make police stations. The Eskom had to produce power lines to Sun City and so on. Just think of the implications for every other government department of building Sun City, you see. So this is one of the things that the Japanese have got really very, very clever at. This is a brilliant idea, I think, is that they say to every other department, you tell us how this measure is going to affect you. And they can come back and say no implications at all, or they come back and say, look, the implications for us are very, very serious. There is no way the court system can handle this new law. Forget it, this new immigration law or whatever it is. So the Japanese at least have got that right. Seems to every now and then just stop going. Okay. France has a very complicated system, as you'd expect the French to do, with various levels, and no one in France actually understands how it works, but they all work with it, and it's a kind of, It's a kind of French cuisine. It's you sniff it and you taste it and you look at it and and it sort of doesn't really work. But it's written about in my text, and the journalists at least can have free copies, but non-journalists can buy the assessment done under the guidance of Mervyn King of King Commission on Governance Guidelines. Nigeria has an interesting legal approach. It's basically lawyers who say, are these laws objective? Are they enforceable? Do they comply with separation of powers, etc.? Are they accessible, and so on? And they don't really bring in proper cost-benefit analysis. And so it goes. Federations like Germany, Belgium, Canada have differences literally from state to state. India, for example, they have national level assessments, but actually the most important ones, for example, in India, are actually at the state level, and each state has its own approach. No country has reached substantial efficiency. Now, this is really quite important to understand. It's been going on for something like 20 years, and it is very much work in progress. And we in South Africa should learn as much as we can from the rest of the world's experience, which has largely been wasted time and money so far, that has not achieved any clear and obvious benefits. And we now have to go, we went from the first generation beginnings to the second generation in Britain, and is now around the world what I would call second generation assessments. We are now in the world moving into third generation assessments, and in South Africa, because we're new at it, we actually have a real opportunity to be the best. We can learn from everyone else and build on, stand on their shoulders and set the new bar. I would really encourage those in the room that are working on this to go away with that in mind, that we are not going to follow the rest of the world, which is what we're doing, and one understands that. You look at what they do and you try to emulate it. No, we should look at the shortcomings. The rest of the world is not achieving what it needs to, and how we can implement a system that overcomes those. What's interesting and worth noting is this is the image of the front page of the Australian guidelines, and you can see their mindset is cutting red tape. That's how they think of it. It's a red tape reduction measure, essentially. That's, I think, a bit myopic. It's much more than that. That should be one aspect of it, but nonetheless you can do it. Now, this idea that it's red tape reduction is quite popular. Now, obviously, I'm a great advocate as a free market person of red tape reduction. I'm not against red tape reduction. I just want to make it very clear that impact assessment is much, much more than merely being critical of red tape. In Britain, they introduced an interesting thing because they found they were just simply not stopping the deluge, the tsunami of new laws and regulations. Just went on and on and on. Government just got bigger and bigger and bigger. More and more cost, more and more controls, less and less benefits, and more market distortion. So they introduced this one in, one out policy, so that every new measure had to be offset by another measure that is scrapped or repealed. Now that's quite interesting. I would encourage us in South Africa to think about that for two reasons. One is we inherited from the apartheid regime just a mountain of regulations and controls, which we basically still have. And I'll give you the most extreme example is land occupied by black South Africans. It's really still governed by the natives, 1913 Natives Land Act, and proclamations 293 and 188, which were presidential proclamations that basically were the mainstay of apartheid and governed black South Africans. That is still to this day how land that black people occupy in South Africa is governed. So one of the things to do is to say, there's lots that can just be repealed and scrapped. So that policy. But then the British found that worked very well. Every new measure was accompanied by one that was being repealed. This was fabulous, so that the government simply stopped just getting bigger and bigger. Departments stopped empire building. They couldn't just keep growing their budgets and their staff and so on. And then they went one step further and they said, no, let's do, it turned out to be quite easy actually, one in, one out. So they said, well, let's do one in, two out. And that's the current policy in Britain, is that every new measure has to be accompanied by the repeal of every one measure must be accompanied by the repeal of two measures of similar impact and gravitas. So they're busy trying to wind back the Leviathan state that just grows and grows and grows. And that's again something in South Africa we should seriously think about. Our government here is now bigger than it has ever been in our history in terms of the proportion of economically active people it employs, capital formation, GDP, national income. By every objective measure, our government is bigger than it has ever been and is growing. And the world's experience tells you that big governments always coincide with economic regression and stagnation. So we are doomed to that unless, under our new system, we do something like this, 1 in, 2 out. China approached the thing in a sort of interesting communistic way, and my column yesterday and the day before in Business Day addressed this issue. They just said, we can't reform the whole of China. It's too complicated. China is, by the way, quite an intensive federation. People think because it's communist, it's centrally planned and run. Not at all. It's actually more devolved probably than any Western or democratic federation, with the maybe exception of Switzerland. But China just said, well, let's just create free zones where we just don't have any regulations or controls at all. And they created 6 special economic zones, big places, you know, maybe the size of Gauteng, say. And this is where 80% of all Chinese business and capital formation takes place. And the whole China story is actually in these special economic zones. And they were such a huge success that they then did a whole lot of other things, open ports and free cities and technical hubs. And so they've basically said, leave China itself, which is just a mess and can't be run, and it's full of old communist controls and regulations. So we just create these special places, which are now, in fact, the freest economies on the planet, the freest economies on Earth. There are no immigration controls, no financial controls. They don't even know what the balance of payments or balance of trade is. There's no reporting or record keeping. Money and capital flow in and out of these zones without any gatekeeping, any monitoring. Commercial banks make assessments, but essentially these zones are the freest economies probably that there have ever been on Earth, or strangely enough in communist China. And we sent South Africans to go and find out how this is done. And because we started these industrial development zones, IDZs, which was just a catastrophe, we spent billions of rands building them, and, you know, nobody built a factory there, or if they did, it had to be heavily subsidized. So I've driven around these places. They've got nice roads and stormwater drains and street lights and sewers and things and security fences, but for the rest, they're vacant. So then they came back and they said, oh, you know what we got wrong in South Africa? We got the name wrong. We called them IDZs. We should have called them Special Economic Zones. So now we call them Special Economic Zones, and these are now meant to be a success. Well, my advice to them is that it actually wasn't the name that was wrong. It's that the special zones aren't special. If you want special economic zones, make them special. What is special about them? For example, they're entirely offshore outside the South African currency system, no foreign exchange controls. They have a tax holiday or tax havens. They are not subject to import controls for plant machinery and equipment, etc. So in other words, sit down and say, let's make our zones special before we call them special zones. And unfortunately, that has not been done. But in China, that's how they went about it. The history of South Africa is that in about 1998, I personally, then part-time managing the Law Review project, started research on the subject, went around the world, studied and wrote up how it's done all over the world. In 2000, the DTI briefed me, commissioned me to give advice on how they could introduce regulatory impact assessments in the DTI. And that essentially was in work in progress when in 2002 the Department of Finance decided to take over and implement for all government departments regulatory impact assessments. And yet at the same time, at the very time it was doing that and saying it's going to impose this on all other government departments, it was itself producing one on phase, sorry, wrongly spelt over there. And as I say, it did. So it was walking the talk, but then it missed the whole point and never went back and said, were those measures actually materialized? Under President Mbeki, the Cabinet Office or the Presidency took over the whole process, worked in conjunction with finance, but employed a full-time economist whose job it was to come up with guidelines, which they did. By 2007, the Presidency approved regulatory impact assessments and said by 2012 that they had been implemented. Now, whether they were or not, nobody seems to know, but certainly the public, there's nothing on the internet, there's no evidence that they were implemented or done. Very elaborate, sophisticated guidelines, very good actually, guidelines, published by the Presidency, adopted by the Cabinet, and the Cabinet said, resolved that these now have to be done for all new measures. As far as I know, not one has been done. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration. If you remember, there were 4 Labour bills once proposed that were subject to regulatory impact assessment, all of which were negative. And what happened is they just ignored them and went ahead in subsequent legislation with the measures anyway. So the Cabinet obviously didn't take it seriously, although a lot of work went into it and the published guidelines were really quite good. If I may say, I think they drew a lot from the work I'd done, and I was very happy about that. Labour law regulatory impact assessments were done but ignored, and then mandatory socio-economic impact assessments were announced in 2005, and the reason I have a question mark is because it's difficult to establish whether this mandate, this obligatory impact assessment, has been in fact followed by every new policy proposal that goes to Cabinet, in and out of Cabinet, and for that matter at other levels of government. So we in theory since last year have it now obligatory, and it's quite interesting. The Secretariat says all new measures have, and there's some members here from the Secretariat, have in fact been subjected to socio-economic impact assessments, and that between 2015 and 2016 there were 117 of them. Now, I have searched in vain on the internet for these, and this is a very, very big issue. In other countries, they are all available. You can look up every one on every measure in other countries, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, America, Britain, and so on and so forth. They are a public process. They're very transparent. They're very public. Everyone can look at them. Everyone can look at the assessment for any measure that has been implemented. What did it say? What did it predict? And what has in fact happened? And in South Africa, if these, well, what it says in our guidelines is that something like, I might have the detail wrong, forgive me for the people here from the Secretariat who know better, but it's something like that it might be released to the public, but only after it's been presented to the Cabinet. Now, as far as I know, none have been released to the public. Certainly I can't find any, and I've never read about or heard about any. And what has been presented to the Cabinet, therefore, is a bit of a mystery. And it does leave me somewhat suspicious that maybe they haven't been particularly good, and maybe the approach is let's first work out how to do it. Let's get some practice, cut our teeth. I understand that. That's also fine. Let's do, 100, 200 or whatever, and then we start posting them all routinely on the internet, and we get input into the process as it's being done. We should be getting all of the role players coming and saying. So the socio-economics are required. Our guidelines say they must be published, but none, as far as I know, have been. And how have people responded to regulatory impact assessments in South Africa? As far as I know, almost nobody knows about them, or apart from the few departmental people working on them. But the general public, the media, hence a media briefing, seem to be blissfully unaware of it. Nobody ever requires it when they appear before portfolio committees. Themba Nolachungu has appeared before many sitting over there. And it would be interesting to know if you've ever heard anyone in a portfolio committee talk about the socio-economic impact assessment for the measure before the committee, and whether any have ever been tabled to your knowledge. Certainly I've been to a few and I've not yet seen any. So it's a measure as yet not fully appreciated or implemented in South Africa. Having said that, let me say that I think it is a very exciting time, because I can think of no other single thing to do in South Africa that is potentially more important. This is it. This is it. If we get this right, the country will be right. I mean, everything else follows. Everything, you can imagine, this is the apex of the triangle. If you get the top right, everything done in the country, every labour measure, every socio-economic measure, every education policy, everything we do will henceforth be efficient, will produce benefits that exceed disadvantages. And so department, now this is the South African system is departments and agencies do their own assessments. I'm going to have a lot to say about that later. The Secretariat oversees the process. It doesn't veto or control it. It sort of tries to give advice and guidance. It's not a signing off authority, which again it should be. The Secretariat members, I'm a bit worried about this. There are just too many. It's just like a fruit salad of everyone who wanted to get involved, instead of just a hardcore of proper experts dedicated to the job, study it worldwide, understand it, police it, enforce it. Instead, there's just this sort of soup or stew of people from every government department and agency sitting on this thing, none of them probably having much knowledge about it at all. They just deployed, they go, I don't know, maybe they do, I don't know, but very little is known about this. And then so-called independent experts. Now, that's a catchy one. I happen to think that maybe there are 3 or 4 people in South Africa you could plausibly call an expert, who've done really quite a lot of work on the subject, so I'm not sure where they find independent ones, let alone dependent ones. But nonetheless, this is work in progress, and they make it very clear that we're going to improve the system, and it's on the way up. So that's actually good. I just think this idea of having someone from every government department and agency in the sort of stew is not a good idea, and there are people here from the steering committee, but that's not what you want. You want a core of strong, independent, autonomous people like the Auditor General, who can take this thing by the scruff of the neck and implement it properly. Socio-economic impact assessments have to be attached, or at least a summary of them in a prescribed form, to every measure proposed to the Cabinet, for example. And it is, you know, have they been, and how good have they been, how thorough have they been, how objective have they been, how balanced have they been, how comprehensive have they been, have they taken into account market distortion risks, have they taken into account potentially unintended consequences, have they taken into account implications for other government departments, have they taken into account compliance costs and inconvenience, especially for low income people in South Africa. You know, then it says that you must consult stakeholders. Well, I know that we now have the sugar tax, the fat tax, the tax on fat people, the tax on people with a sweet tooth, which I think is a very strange thing to stigmatize and discriminate against and villainize people who happen to like sugar. I don't personally, so I can say this. But nonetheless, as far as I know, the sugar industry was never consulted. It just was introduced. So so here we have right now, since the measure is supposedly applied to everything, here we have an example of where I'm assured by the people, the biggest stakeholders of all. Well, the biggest stakeholders of all are actually fat people, obese people, people who like sweet things. None of them that I've spoken to were consulted. You know, I go up to people and say, look, you're morbidly obese, were you consulted? And then after I've been clopped, they say, no, I wasn't, but nonetheless. But certainly the sugar industry wasn't, and it's very small and narrow, and everyone knows everyone else, so we know with a relatively high degree of certainty they weren't consulted. On the contrary, when they wanted to be consulted, there was reluctance to even let them in the door and meet with them by the department, what I call the Department for Health and Against Freedom. So the South African system goes through 6 stages: decision to address an identified problem. In other words, you start off by saying, we have a problem. And what is that problem? Let's do something about the problem. Now, that's what's called in law the mischief principle, or the problem assessment or statement. You have to start by saying, why do you want to do anything at all? Now, take, for example, this Twin Peaks measure with Financial Services Board. No one did that. They just said, let's have Twin Peaks. Nobody said, this is the problem which needs solving. And therefore, we need to do something that's going to cost us probably another 4 billion for the government, and maybe, many more billions for the rest of society. So you identify the problem. And this is our South African guidelines, in our guidelines. Then the initial assessment has to be done, and this is important. I'm very encouraged by our guidelines, and they're very, very good. I'm going to make some recommendations for improvements, but let me make it immediately clear that it was very pleasing to see them and to work through them and see what's planned. And I think the fact that I have suggestions for improvement is not to be regarded disproportionately critical. The initial assessment has to include options. Now, this is quite important. This was found around the world as a very important thing to do, and it was a late introduction in what we might call model 2 or stage 2 or second generation, which is that you have to say, what else did you consider doing? So say, for example, you want to deal with dangerous dogs. You say, what else did you consider? You have to say, well, we considered simply banning them. We considered taxing them. We considered having all the male dangerous dogs neutered. And you have to give in Britain, for example, 4 alternatives. And then there's an extra one added, which was added by Tony Blair, which is to say, what measures are already in place that might be causing the problem that could be repealed? Now, that's quite important. As you say, aren't there already counterproductive regulations? And what you're trying to do is you're trying to fix a problem created by bad policy. Having a little bit of regulation is like being a little bit pregnant. You just get more and more and more. And so what they say is, no, what have you considered for repeal? And then if you couldn't find anything that would solve the problem by repealing it or relaxing it, then what are the at least 4 alternatives? Australia has 3, South Africa, I think, might have 3, I can't remember. But you say, what else did you consider, and why did you reject the others? You have to explain why. You have to motivate why. And then you select one, the favorite one, the basic one as it's called in our regulations, and then you do a final assessment, and this is where it is meant to be published. And as far as I know, has not been, or is not routinely done in our own guidelines. And then after the measure is implemented, then you have to revise and monitor and take submissions before it's implemented, you have to say whether the assessment was revised based on submissions. What's lacking in South Africa is 7, which is what you do afterwards to see that you've met the targets and you haven't exceeded the costs. That we'll get to in a moment. So the virtues in South Africa, I'll run through these quite quickly, the virtuous parts, and there are many, so I'm not going to elaborate on this, is that it's a start, and I think that our own guidelines see that and say that. This is work in progress. It'll evolve. We'll get better and better at it. That's very positive. Not the belief that we've got it right, which no one has anywhere in the world. But what we can do is stand on their shoulders and have the best in the world. And I don't think we've done that. We've tended to follow rather than take the lead. It is mandatory. That's very good. It has to be done by every new measure, whether it's internal, departmental or not. And it has to be done proportionately to the measure. And then they have to identify alternatives. That's very good. And we have to, and then this is very, very big, is to avoid unintended consequences. What might take, for example, the National Credit Act in South Africa. I'll give you some, well, let's take the Consumer Act, Consumer Protection Act. If you had considered unintended consequences of the Consumer Act, which was not done, it was drafted by a crazy Australian called Frank Knight, why we commissioned him, heaven alone knows, and he went and plagiarized some legislation from one of the American states, because I found the same wording in there. But anyway, that doesn't matter. But a simple question would have been, let me give you a simple example. Our Consumer Protection Act says that to protect consumers, footstool sales are banned. In other words, you can no longer sell a used computer as is. It now must come with a guarantee. Now, everything now must have a warranty, a guarantee. Now, that's a benefit. This is consumer protection. But say they were asked to say, what's the cost? What is the unintended consequence of this measure? Well, think of a peasant farmer who wants to buy a used plough or pump or tractor or bakkie or wagon. And at the moment, you can buy an old skedonk bakkie for 10,000 rand if you buy it voetstoots. However, you now must buy, the consumer is forced to buy, a warranty. Well, how much will that be? I've asked around, and it's probably 50 to 60,000 rand. So now the poor, you people will go and buy cars, you won't know the difference. But a poor person will now no longer be able to buy a 10,000 rand skedonk, now has to buy a 70,000 or 60,000 rand vehicle. What does this do? It puts the poor peasant farmer out of business. They can't, you know, if you want to buy a used fridge, a used microwave, a used pump, a used anything, furniture, any carpets, anything, mattress, you know, have to, the consumer must buy a guarantee. Now, I don't know how that protects consumers. That seems to me to victimize, especially poor consumers. And that's just one measure. There's a compulsory cooling off period, for example. Now, think of spaza shops, tuck shops in the townships and in the rural areas. They now suddenly have to give a cooling off period. So now they have to find a way of keeping records of who bought what. They have to find a way of taking back goods during the cooling off period and somehow repackaging them and checking them and giving cash refunds and putting them back into stock and so on and so forth. It's clearly impossible, and it clearly just won't be done. So the law will just be ignored. What will Pick and Pay do? They will have new staff and new costs, and they will have to add the price to the price of the consumer goods. There's no free lunch. Consumers must buy that cooling off period. So the consumer is not entitled to go and say, look, I don't need a cooling off period, give me a discount. The supplier has to say, look, I'm sorry. Whether you or I like it or not, you have to purchase a cooling off period. I have to install the administrative and costly procedures to be able to handle returned goods from consumers who don't have to give a reason, they just change their mind within 10 days or whatever it is. So, unintended consequences, if they are assessed in a thing like the Consumer Protection Act or the National Credit Act, for example, interest rates are limited. What does that mean? It means people in this room can all get credit, but it means the poor can't, because no one will provide a smaller loan, because the admin cost is as much as a big loan, and no one will take the risk on a small loan or a risky borrower. So it drives credit. Unintended consequences drive it out of the market for the poor. Then there's, you have to, in our guidelines, you have to mitigate risks. Sorry, what I was saying about that, just bearing in mind, is if we had socio-economic assessments at the time of, say, the Consumer Protection Act, I assume that act would never have been passed. It was only passed because nobody thought about the unintended consequences and costs. It was just a sort of sexy thing of let's have benefits for consumers. Well, you can list all the benefits. It's just pages. It's a wish list of nice things for consumers with not one sentence being devoted in the motivational memorandum to who will pay for these incentives. And the answer is obviously consumers, and low-income consumers pay disproportionately more, and therefore it's a regressive measure, so-called. You have to mitigate risks, in other words, avoid distortion effects. Take, for example, labor law. You can have nice working conditions, decent working, living wage, all of that thing, conditions of employment for workers. But will this distort labour markets? Will it, for example, bias labour markets in favour of skilled high-tech workers with high capital machinery against unskilled, uneducated, unsophisticated, young, old, rural, whatever workers, disabled? And that would have to have been asked, which it wasn't. In other words, all we did was assume you can have good working conditions and high pay at no cost. This should change that if it's done properly. Then there is a very interesting thing in South Africa which is born of our past, and I'm worried about it making too much of it, but it's good that it's there. It says because of our distortions and our inequalities and differences between groups, but it talks about men and women and old and young and of course the racial groups, and that the impact assessments have to take into account the differential impacts and implications for different groups. And I think that's good. I haven't seen that anywhere else in the world. Probably does exist, I'm just not aware of it. But I think it's good here. Unfortunately, in the guidelines, this seems to be a sort of drum it beats. I think it's got a risk of running away with itself and becoming an excuse for taking measures which are not sensible. In other words, you say, oh no, but this is required because we're going to protect, transgender people will be protected, and therefore we have to have a measure that will disadvantage all other people, or whatever. We want to, of course, make sure the rights of transgender people are fully protected, but the purpose of a socio-economic impact assessment is to say, at what cost? Who will be disadvantaged and how much, and is that a price we're willing to pay? Just for those of you that are constitutional lawyers, I know some here are familiar with the Constitution. There's an entertaining little thing in our Constitution. Wherever a public official is appointed, an auditor general or whatever, it says that a man or a woman shall be appointed as the Chief Justice. Why it does that, I don't know, but every person referred to in the Constitution has to be a man or a woman. That means, for example, Caster Semenya couldn't be a judge or president or member of parliament or whatever it might be. It's very strange, but there we have it. Transgender people. So that's one of the things. Its virtues are all measures must be assessed, and it's not once off, it's ongoing. In other words, you don't sign it off, they did with the phase thing, but you actually keep at it. It doesn't just disappear once you've done it. And it cautions against vested interest, but not against government. I think that's sorely lacking here, is to realize that government departments are themselves probably the most dangerous vested interest of all. And they are ones who assess themselves, and that's obviously dangerous. So unintended consequences are the big focus of the South African measure. Opportunities, things that I think can be revisited or improved, and this is the last stretch over here. It's taken a while, but I've had to go into some detail because this is so new to most South Africans. Insufficient account has been taken of the world's experience. It seems to me clear that the drafters of our guidelines really didn't put the effort, the legwork I did, into working out what the rest of the world has done, what it's learnt, how it varies from place to place. We seem to have just really followed the British model with a few adjustments, but and that's not good enough. The self-assessment thing, in my view, is possibly a fatal flaw. I think if unless that is changed, it's actually it'll all be a waste of time. Unless we get the Secretariat, which is represented here, to be either the organization that does the assessments, which I think would be the best, or certainly no assessment can proceed until it has signed it off. It's got to have a veto power. So I want the steering group to be totally empowered to say they are the gatekeeper. If you don't get past them, you can't do it, because they will get all of these phony assessments from the departments appearing to justify what they want to do. They have to have the competence, the ability, the professionalism, and the power to say no, that is not correctly done, we're vetoing it. And so they need to be truly autonomous, not that fruit salad of government representatives, and they need to have a veto power, and they need to. But it does say over there that improvements and empowerment will follow, so we'll have to monitor that, and hopefully it does so properly. Then it says not everything can be quantified, and that I think is a mistake. Everything can be. Everything must be. There are no exceptions. And that was, I can understand people who may be not familiar with it all thinking, well, there must be some things you can't really quantify. No, as they've learnt in other countries, there are no things, and if you leave that little escape valve, it's going to be the source of lots of mischief. People claiming amorphous benefits that can't be quantified. No, they can and must, and if they can't be quantified, you can't have the measure. And then it has insufficient scope. Our guidelines do not, for example, require constitutionality screening. Now, our state law advisor does not have the power to veto unconstitutional provisions in law. I've had much to do with the state law advisor's office. They have often said to government departments, what you want to do is unconstitutional, and they've gone ahead anyway and just ignored them. So we should have in the Socio Economic Impact Assessment, including as the Dutch and others do, the Germans, a quality of law assessment. In other words, is this constitutional? Is this good law? Is it not retroactive? Does it create objective criteria? Is it accessible? Is it simple? Does it create discretionary power that can lead to corruption and abuse, etc.? So we need a good law, quality of law assessment, and here I would recommend replicating what the Dutch do. They have a thing called the Quality of Law Academy in the Department of Justice, which is just experts on legal drafting and constitutionality, and every measure has to be signed off by them, vetoed. If they don't sign it, it can't go ahead. And then the other thing we don't have is a small business impact assessment. Now, our Minister for Small Business, Louw, has actually spoken about the need for this. I've personally had meetings with her, and I hope that she will lobby successfully in the Cabinet to make this a requirement, is that every measure must include a small business impact assessment. For example, if you take what I said, the Consumer Protection Act, if you try and do the impact on small business of that act, if you really try to enforce it, which mercifully they don't, will be devastating. It will put just essentially most small businesses out of business. Say, for example, the street trading bylaws. Johannesburg, 2 years ago, cleared 6,000 street traders off the streets. The department's cleansing department, the people who clear litter, were charged with a thing called Operation Clean Sweep, to sweep human beings off the streets as if they are litter. I thought it was just absolutely despicable. I don't know how this could have happened. I don't know what kind of human beings could have been behind this. We were instrumental to taking this to the Constitutional Court, which within a month ruled that they had to be let back onto the streets. And we are now busy laying criminal charges against the City Council because they've ignored the Constitutional Court order, and they continue treating street traders in exactly the same inhumane, despicable way. But certainly, if you subjected the municipal street trading bylaws and for example, zoning bylaws to regulatory impact assessment, a small business impact assessment, you would have to reject them completely. Take the zoning laws. The whole point about apartheid was that black areas or townships or locations or settlements were dormitory towns. They didn't have zoning, no business rights, no CBD, no anything. That's still the case to this day. Most of the areas where black people live are unzoned. So now the law, the municipal bylaw of every city, as far as I know, if there are any exceptions, I don't know them, says that you may conduct business lawfully only on zoned properties. That basically says black South Africans to this very day cannot lawfully run businesses. They can apply for a consent use, which might cost you 100,000 rand, and you will only do that if you're a very rich shebeen owner or somebody. But certainly a tuck shop owner, spaza owner, street vendor, whatever, a peasant, someone who makes burglar bars in their backyard, somebody who does tailoring in their spare room, etc., etc. These will never be able to comply. So the municipal laws of every South African town and city to this day are a vicious assault, racial assault. And I'm not apologizing for that. It's a racist assault on black South Africans who are being subjected to the very worst of apartheid 21 years after it's meant to have gone. Essentially nothing has changed. And on the contrary, we now have draft liquor trading laws from the Department of Trade and Industry, which says that no liquor license may be issued in an unzoned area. Now, it's not only a zoned property now. In other words, Soweto, Kotlahong, Diepsloot, the Transkei, these are unzoned areas. No lawful liquor license. That's what the draft says now. Now, according to the steering committee, we are told every new measure has a socio-economic impact assessment. Where is the one for the proposed liquor regulations? I don't believe there can be one, because it would have to say that they are just completely absurd, racially absurd, economically absurd, socially absurd. For example, it says that there may be no liquor license within half a kilometre of a transport facility. An airport, a harbour, a ship, an aeroplane, an entertainment facility. No liquor license at Sun City, Wild Coast Sun. The entertainment in Sandton, no liquor license in Sandton City, because they're cinemas. A health facility, a doctor's consulting rooms, and so on. I mean, now, if there is one, I want the steering committee to tell me and show me, because whoever did it could not have actually read the measure. Nobody who reads that measure can take it seriously. It is self-evidently absurdity on steroids. Who wrote it? I mean, I would love to meet the person who wrote it. I want to go and take them to dinner and say, what were you thinking? Like, I issued a challenge, by the way, when I met for 4.5 hours with the directors in the Department of Trade and Industry who are responsible for the measure. I said to them, I will give you 10,000 rand cash. It's not a bet. I can't win. Only you can win. If you can find me one property, just one, anywhere in South Africa where a liquor license would be lawful under this proposal that you've just published. Just one. One property, you get 10,000 rand cash. It essentially bans all liquor trade in the whole of South Africa. That's what's before us. So, small business impact assessment. Public participation, I think, has been absent, and the opportunities for South Africa, this is the last slide. No mandatory, this is missing, mandatory follow-up and monitoring and revision and sunset clauses. That should be added. And it looks at only future measures being assessed, whereas in fact we have a legacy of measures that are devastating and are in greater need of revision. So we should look at the past, unemployment impacts and so on. And then at the legacy of apartheid, things like Eskom, SA Airways, they should be subjected to impact assessments. And the black land issue in South Africa, the way black land is administered to this day, should, for example, be subjected to a socio-economic impact assessment. I think it will be so embarrassing that it will be changed. So there are some anomalies, and I want to just get on to this one over here. Interestingly, there is no socio-economic impact assessment of socio-economic impact assessments. Now, I found this very odd. I went around the world and I said to people, you are the socio-economic impact assessment unit of the British Cabinet Office. You administer a thing that is costing the British public billions of pounds and subjecting government departments to huge amounts of cost and red tape and so on. Has what you have been done assessed? How do we know the net benefits to income, to socio-economic assessment? So they should start by having a self-assessment or having someone else assess them. But it's quite strange to me, this. It's very odd that the very people who preach socio-economic impact assessments have not themselves conducted a socio-economic assessment on what they do. And what they do has not been assessed. So that to me is very strange, and I would encourage South Africa, again, we can be the best. Why don't we be the first in the world to actually make sure that our socio-economic impact assessment process works, that we can see what changes it results in, what improvements it results in. It should itself be monitored to see that it's efficient and effective. Otherwise, we are truly wasting our time. It'll just be a cosmetic exercise. So one of the other little thoughts I had is the 1912 Regulatory Impact Assessment Guidelines issued by the Cabinet, long and sophisticated, seem to have disappeared, and someone started again. I'm not sure why. They should have really just taken those and edited them a little. So going forward, as the Americans say, I never understand in what other direction Americans can go. They always talk about what will they do going forward. Well, I always wonder, well, what will they do going backwards? But anyway, going forward. We have the start of a process. It mustn't be a sham. We must make sure it works. And remember, as Milton Friedman, not everyone in this room will be a fan of his, but nonetheless, I don't think you can disagree that one of the great mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than their results.